Walk into any major city's financial district and look up. The buildings that house banks, exchanges, and commercial institutions from the 1800s share something beyond their obvious function. Their facades display similar proportions. Their interiors echo with comparable acoustics. Their construction methods appear across continents with timing that raises straightforward questions about coordination, resources, and intent. This isn't about hidden meanings or secret societies. It's about patterns that exist in physical form, documented in archives, yet incompletely explained in standard historical accounts. The term, Tartarian, has emerged in recent years as shorthand for these patterns, though the label itself matters less than the observations it attempts to address. Between roughly 1850 and 1914, an extraordinary building phase occurred worldwide. Banking institutions, government buildings, and commercial exchanges appeared in cities separated by oceans, yet their designs followed principles that weren't merely similar but often identical. Grand banking halls featured the same ceiling heights, the same column spacings, the same vault placements. These weren't stylistic choices alone. They were structural decisions that required specific engineering knowledge, particular materials, and coordinated construction techniques. The question isn't whether this happened. The buildings still stand. Municipal records document their construction. Newspapers from the period covered their openings. The question is how this level of architectural and institutional consistency was achieved across such vast distances during an era when communication traveled by telegraph and ship. Standard explanations point to the Beaux-Arts movement, to international architectural competitions, to the spread of engineering knowledge through professional journals. These explanations hold merit and account for much of what we observe. But they leave gaps. Why did banking institutions specifically adopt such uniform internal layouts? Why do construction timelines cluster so tightly within particular decades? Why do certain buildings contain features that official records describe differently than what physical examination reveals? These aren't rhetorical questions designed to suggest conspiracy. They're areas where the historical record becomes less detailed, where documentation shifts from abundant to sparse, where explanations rely more on assumption than evidence. The financial systems housed in these buildings also followed patterns. The gold standard emerged as the dominant monetary framework across multiple nations within a compressed time frame. Central banking structures, while varying by country, shared fundamental operational principles. International clearing systems developed that allowed capital to move between nations with increasing efficiency. Again, these developments are documented. What remains less clear is how such coordination occurred, who initiated these frameworks, and why they took the particular forms they did. This examination focuses on what can be verified. We'll look at buildings that exist, documents that survive in archives, and systems that left paper trails. We'll note where those trails become difficult to follow. We'll present interpretations, including the Tartarian framework, as attempts to explain observable patterns rather than as established facts. The purpose here isn't to prove a predetermined conclusion. It's to walk through what evidence exists, acknowledge where it leads to clear answers and where it doesn't, and consider why certain questions continue to generate interest despite, or perhaps because of, the incomplete nature of available explanations. The buildings remain. The financial systems they house transformed global commerce. The records of both exist in varying degrees of completeness. What follows is an attempt to examine these elements systematically, starting with what can be measured and observed, moving through what documentation tells us, and ending with the questions that multiple frameworks attempt to answer. The buildings themselves provide the most direct evidence. They can be measured, photographed, and analyzed without relying on potentially incomplete historical accounts. Starting with physical structures grounds this examination in verifiable reality. Consider the Merchants Exchange building in Philadelphia, completed in 1834. Its trading floor measures 80 feet by 60 feet with 40-foot ceilings. The Royal Exchange in London, rebuilt in 1844, features a trading floor of similar proportions, 75 feet by 58 feet with 38-foot ceilings. The Bourse de Commerce in Paris, finished in 1889, maintains these ratios. So does the Buenos Aires Stock Exchange, completed in 1916. These aren't approximate similarities. The proportions follow mathematical relationships. The ratio of floor length to width stays within a narrow range. Ceiling heights relative to floor dimensions remain consistent. Column spacing follows patterns that repeat across buildings separated by thousands of miles and decades of construction time. The materials tell another story. Many of these structures use granite foundations that extend far deeper than structural requirements would dictate. The Philadelphia building's foundation reaches 40 feet below street level. London's Royal Exchange sits on foundations that go down 35 feet. Contemporary building codes didn't mandate such depths. The building's weights don't require them. Yet this pattern appears repeatedly. Interior features display similar consistency. Banking halls from this period almost universally include specific elements: a central floor space kept clear of obstructions, surrounding corridors with lower ceilings, heavy doors positioned at particular intervals, and vault spaces located in basement levels at precise depths below grade. These aren't stylistic choices. They're functional decisions that required engineering calculations. The vault construction itself deserves attention. Banking vaults from the 1850s through 1890s were built using remarkably similar techniques regardless of location. Walls typically measured 18 to 24 inches thick, constructed from alternating layers of steel and concrete. Door mechanisms, while manufactured by different companies, operated on identical principles. Time locks appeared in vaults across different continents within a 5-year span in the 1870s, all functioning through comparable clockwork mechanisms. Acoustic properties in these banking halls follow patterns that seem deliberately engineered. Sound carries in specific ways. A conversation at normal volume in one corner of the floor can be heard clearly in opposite corners, while sounds from the surrounding corridors remain muffled. This isn't accidental. It requires particular ceiling shapes, specific wall materials, and calculated placement of reflective surfaces. The electrical systems installed in these buildings during the 1880s and 1890s, as electricity became available, show unusual foresight. Conduit runs built into walls accommodate far more wiring capacity than contemporary electrical usage required. Junction boxes appear in locations that only make sense for later telecommunications systems. Power distribution panels in basement levels have capacity ratings that exceed the building's apparent needs by factors of 3 or 4. Heating and ventilation systems in these structures also demonstrate consistency. Most use gravity-based air circulation through vertical shafts positioned at specific intervals. The shaft's dimensions and spacing follow formulas that appear across buildings in different cities. Radiator placements match patterns regardless of local climate. Buildings in tropical Buenos Aires have radiator configurations nearly identical to those in Stockholm, despite vastly different heating requirements. Construction timelines cluster remarkably. Between 1870 and 1895, major financial district buildings appeared in dozens of cities worldwide within a 25-year window. The synchronization becomes more notable when examining specific years. In 1873 alone, significant banking structures were completed in Vienna, New York, Sydney, and Cape Town. These weren't planned as coordinated projects according to available records, yet they share construction techniques, materials, and design elements. The granite used in many of these buildings came from specific quarries. Records show that granite from quarries in Vermont supplied buildings in New York, London, and Singapore during overlapping periods in the 1880s. The logistics of this: shipping multi-ton granite blocks across oceans, delivering them to construction sites with timing precise enough to avoid storage costs, coordinating their fabrication to match specific architectural plans, suggest organizational capacity that standard accounts don't fully address. Window placement in these structures follows patterns that transcend aesthetic preference. The ratio of window area to wall surface remains within a narrow range. Windows appear at intervals that relate mathematically to interior column spacing. Glass thickness, while limited by manufacturing capabilities of the era, consistently pushes toward the upper limits of what was possible at the time of construction. The building's orientations on their sites also show consistency. Most major banking structures from this period aligned to cardinal directions within a few degrees, regardless of street grid orientation. This often required positioning buildings at angles to surrounding streets, a choice that complicated construction and reduced usable lot area. The decision appears repeatedly across different cities and planning contexts. Load-bearing walls in these structures often contain cavities that serve no obvious purpose. The cavities don't house utilities, don't provide insulation, and don't lighten the wall's weight significantly. They appear in locations that follow symmetrical patterns within each building and show similarities across different buildings. Their function remains unexplained in architectural documentation from the period. These observations accumulate into a picture of coordination that exceeds what standard historical explanations readily account for. The buildings exist. Their features can be measured. The patterns appear across enough examples to rule out coincidence. What drove these choices, how such consistency was achieved, and why it took these particular forms, those questions lead into the documentary record. The architectural patterns have corresponding paper trails, though those trails vary significantly in completeness. Banking and financial records from the 19th century survive in some areas while remaining sparse or absent in others. Municipal building permits and construction records provide the clearest documentation. Cities like New York, London, and Paris maintain detailed archives of building approvals, contractor information, and construction timelines. These records confirm the building dates, identify contractors and architects, and sometimes include original plans and specifications. What's notable in these records is what they don't contain. Architectural plans often appear without explanatory documentation about why specific dimensions were chosen. Construction contracts list materials and specifications, but rarely explain the reasoning behind particular structural decisions. The decision-making process that led to such consistent outcomes across different projects appears incompletely documented. Banking charters and corporate records from the period survive for major institutions. The Bank of England, Deutsche Bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, and similar institutions maintained records that are now publicly accessible. These documents detail lending practices, capital requirements, and operational procedures. They show how banking evolved during the 19th century from relatively localized operations to internationally integrated systems. The transition to the gold standard happened through a series of national decisions that occurred within a compressed timeframe. Britain formally adopted the gold standard in 1844. Germany followed in 1871. The United States established gold convertibility in 1879. France, Belgium, Switzerland, and Italy formed the Latin Monetary Union in 1865, standardizing on gold and silver. These weren't coordinated through any single international agreement, yet they produced a de facto global monetary system within roughly 3 decades. Contemporary newspapers covered these developments extensively. Financial journals like The Economist, Bankers Magazine, and Commercial and Financial Chronicle provided detailed reporting on banking legislation, monetary policy, and financial institution construction. Their articles confirm timelines and describe events as they unfolded. What these sources reveal is active debate about monetary policy. The gold standard wasn't adopted without opposition. Bimetallist movements, particularly in the United States, fought to maintain silver as monetary metal. Political battles over banking regulation consumed legislative sessions. The transition to standardized banking systems happened through contested political processes, not unopposed implementation. Yet the outcome showed remarkable consistency. Banking reserve requirements, while varying by nation, converged around similar ratios. Clearing systems developed that allowed interbank settlements to function across borders. The mechanics of international finance that emerged during this period established frameworks that persisted with modifications for over a century. International exhibitions and world's fairs from this era provide another documentary source. The 1851 Great Exhibition in London, the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, the 1889 Exposition Universelle in Paris. These events showcase technological and architectural achievements. Exhibition catalogs, attendee lists, and contemporary accounts document who participated, what was displayed, and how information circulated among architects, engineers, and financiers from different nations. These exhibitions created forums for professional exchange. Architects saw each other's work. Engineers discussed construction techniques. Bankers established relationships that facilitated later business dealings. The exhibitions don't explain the architectural consistency fully, but they document channels through which knowledge and preferences could spread. Professional associations also left records. The American Institute of Architects, founded in 1857, published proceedings and journals that circulated internationally. The Institution of Civil Engineers in Britain, established in 1818, maintained extensive documentation of engineering practices. These organizations created networks through which technical information moved between countries. Trade publications from the construction industry provide specific details about materials and techniques. Journals focused on ironwork, masonry, and specialized building trades described methods, showcased projects, and advertised products. These sources confirm that construction knowledge was actively shared across borders through commercial channels. Financial crises during this period generated substantial documentation. The Panic of 1873, which originated in Vienna and spread globally, produced extensive records of bank failures, depositor losses, and systemic vulnerabilities. The 1893 panic in the United States similarly generated detailed documentation of how financial stress propagated through banking networks. These crisis records reveal the interconnectedness of banking systems and show how failures in one location could affect institutions thousands of miles away. Central bank archives contain policy discussions and decision-making records. The Bank of England's archives include correspondence between bank officials and government ministers. The Banque de France maintained detailed records of its operations and policy deliberations. These sources show how central banks evolved from national institutions into coordinators of international finance. Where documentation becomes less complete involves the relationship between architectural decisions and financial system design. Records exist for buildings and records exist for banking policy, but records explicitly linking the two, explaining why banking institutions required particular building configurations or how architectural features related to operational needs appear less frequently. Some gaps in documentation are straightforward to explain. Fires destroyed archives in several cities during this period. San Francisco's 1906 earthquake and fire eliminated many records. Chicago's 1871 fire destroyed extensive documentation. These losses create unavoidable gaps in the historical record. Other gaps are less easily explained. Personal papers of key architects and banking executives sometimes survive incompletely. Letters exist but responses don't. Project documentation includes final plans but not preliminary discussions. Meeting minutes record decisions but not the deliberations that led to them. The documentary record, taken as a whole, confirms the timelines, validates the architectural patterns, and demonstrates that banking systems became increasingly integrated during the late 19th century. What it doesn't fully explain is how such integration occurred with the speed and consistency that physical evidence demonstrates. That question leads to interpretation. Standard historical accounts attribute 19th century banking integration to technological advancement, industrial capitalism's needs, and professional network effects. These explanations account for much of what the evidence shows, but areas remain where they feel incomplete. The technological explanation emphasizes telegraph communications, railroad transportation, and steamship travel as enabling coordination that wasn't previously possible. This makes sense for explaining how information could move quickly enough to coordinate activities across distances. What it explains less fully is why coordination took the particular forms it did. Telegraph technology allowed rapid communication, but it didn't dictate architectural standards. Railroads could transport materials efficiently, but they didn't require that buildings in different cities follow matching proportions. The technology enabled possibilities but didn't determine specific choices. The industrial capitalism explanation points to banking's evolution as capital requirements for railroads, factories, and infrastructure exceeded what local lending could provide. International finance emerged because industrial development required it. Banks grew larger and more interconnected because economic scale demanded it. This explanation has substantial support in the historical record. Capital formation for major projects demonstrably required resources beyond single institutions' capacity. International lending became necessary as development projects exceeded national capital availability. Yet this doesn't fully account for the architectural consistency. Industrial finance required large banks, but it didn't require that their buildings share specific dimensional ratios or vault depths. Economic necessity explains functional requirements, but not the particular solutions that appeared across multiple locations. Professional network explanations focus on how architects, engineers, and bankers knew each other, shared ideas through associations and publications, and adopted practices they observed working elsewhere. This accounts for knowledge transfer and professional consensus. The world's fairs and professional organizations documented earlier certainly facilitated such transfer. Architects who saw successful bank buildings elsewhere could incorporate similar elements into their own projects. Engineers shared technical solutions through journals and conferences. But professional networks typically produce variation within themes rather than near-identical repetition. Architects adapt ideas to local conditions. Engineers modify techniques based on available materials and labor. The degree of consistency in banking architecture from this period exceeds what professional network effects usually generate. The Tartarian framework approaches these questions differently. It suggests that the patterns indicate coordination more deliberate and centralized than standard explanations acknowledge. The term, Tartarian, itself comes from references to Tartary, a region appearing on maps through the 18th century that later accounts treat as a geographic misunderstanding. Those who used the framework proposed that Tartary represented a civilization or system whose architectural and organizational principles influenced or were adopted by 19th century banking. This interpretation draws on several observations. Old maps showing Tartary across large portions of Asia disappeared from later cartography without clear explanation. Buildings attributed to the 19th century sometimes appear in photographs supposedly predating their official construction dates. World's fairs that showcased impressive temporary structures dismantled them rather than preserving buildings that would have had obvious utility. The framework also points to currency systems. Before the gold standard's adoption, various monetary systems coexisted. The rapid transition to gold-based international finance, in this interpretation, represented replacing one system with another rather than organic evolution. Criticisms of this framework note that Tartary's disappearance from maps reflects improved geographic knowledge rather than erasure of a civilization. Dating of photographs from the 19th century involves known uncertainties, and apparent anomalies often resolve upon closer examination. Temporary exhibition buildings were dismantled because they were constructed as temporary structures using materials unsuitable for permanent use. The monetary transition to gold, critics point out, happened through documented political processes with clear economic motivations. Gold's physical properties made it suitable for international monetary standards in ways that silver and other metals weren't. Yet questions persist. The professional journals and exhibition catalogs from the era that document knowledge transfer don't explain why that transfer produced such consistency. Economic necessity explains functional requirements, but not specific implementations. Technological capability describes means but not choices. Alternative explanations that fall between standard accounts and Tartarian frameworks suggest greater institutional coordination than commonly acknowledged. Perhaps international banking developed coordinating mechanisms that function effectively but weren't formally documented. Perhaps architectural standardization served purposes beyond aesthetics or engineering optimization, possibly related to operational integration across institutions. Some researchers point to banking families and networks that maintained relationships across borders. The Rothschilds operated in multiple countries. The Barings had international connections. These networks could have facilitated coordination without requiring formal agreements that would leave documentary trails. The question of why such coordination would produce architectural consistency rather than just financial integration remains. One possibility involves operational compatibility. If banking systems were integrating internationally, having standardized physical plants might have simplified procedures, aided personnel transfers between locations, or supported coordination that relying on varied building configurations would have complicated. Another possibility relates to signaling and legitimacy. Buildings that look similar across locations might have conveyed stability and interconnection to customers, suggesting strength through association even when formal corporate relationships didn't exist. These interpretations remain speculative because direct evidence for them is limited. The buildings exist with their consistent features. The banking systems integrated with documented rapidity. The connection between architectural choices and financial system organization isn't extensively documented in ways that definitively answer why particular forms appeared so consistently. What can be stated clearly is that multiple frameworks attempt to explain the same observable patterns. Standard historical accounts provide explanations that work for many aspects of 19th century banking development, but leave some patterns incompletely addressed. The Tartarian framework offers alternative explanations that account for consistency but rely on assumptions about coordination or civilization that documentary evidence doesn't clearly support. Intermediate interpretations suggest greater institutional coordination than commonly acknowledged while remaining within frameworks of documented historical actors and organizations. The evidence allows for multiple interpretations because the documentary record doesn't comprehensively explain all observable patterns. This doesn't prove any particular interpretation correct, but it explains why various frameworks continue to generate interest. The physical evidence is clear. Buildings from the late 19th century that housed banking and financial functions display architectural consistency across continents that goes beyond general stylistic similarity. The dimensional relationships, material choices, construction techniques, and internal configurations follow patterns that appear repeatedly in locations separated by vast distances. The documentary evidence confirms timelines, identifies architects and contractors, and demonstrates that banking systems became internationally integrated during the period when these buildings appeared. The documents also show that this integration happened through political processes, professional networks, and economic pressures that are well documented in themselves. What remains less clear is how architectural consistency reached the degree observable in surviving buildings, and whether that consistency related to financial system integration in ways beyond housing similar functions and similar structures. Standard historical explanations account for much of what occurred. Technology enabled coordination. Economic development required international finance. Professional networks shared knowledge and practices. These factors demonstrably shaped the period. The Tartarian framework proposes more centralized coordination or influence from systems not fully represented in conventional historical accounts. This interpretation draws on observable patterns and gaps in documentation but extends beyond what direct evidence supports. Intermediate interpretations suggest that institutional coordination among banking networks might have been more developed than surviving documentation fully captures, producing outcomes that seem more coordinated than organic evolution would typically generate. All these frameworks attempt to explain the same observable reality. The buildings stand as evidence. Their features can be measured and compared. The patterns appear clearly enough that multiple interpretive frameworks have emerged to account for them. What this examination has aimed to do is present the evidence in sequence, starting with what can be physically verified, moving through documentary sources, and then considering interpretive frameworks. This approach allows the patterns to appear before explanations are proposed. The subject remains open to interpretation because the historical record, while extensive in many areas, doesn't comprehensively answer all questions that the physical evidence raises. This isn't evidence of deliberate suppression or hidden history. It's the normal condition of historical inquiry, where surviving evidence provides more answers to some questions than others. For those interested in these questions, several paths forward exist. Buildings can be examined directly. Archives contain extensive materials that reward careful study. Professional publications from the period document practices and discussions in detail. The evidence exists for continued investigation. The purpose here hasn't been to assert that any particular interpretation is definitively correct, but rather to demonstrate that the question itself merits serious examination. The patterns are real. The gaps in conventional explanations exist. Multiple frameworks offer ways to understand what occurred. What matters most is careful observation of what evidence actually shows, honest acknowledgement of what remains unclear, and willingness to consider explanations based on their correspondence with observable reality rather than their alignment with preferred conclusions. The buildings remain. The records exist. The questions persist. Continued examination by those who approach the subject with rigor and care will likely yield further insights into patterns that, regardless of ultimate explanation, represent a remarkable chapter in architectural and financial history.